There is a version of World War I that most people carry with them without ever examining it too closely. It involves muddy trenches and poppies. It involves young men going over the top in neat waves, dying for something that mattered, their sacrifice preserved in stone memorials and government pamphlets. It is a version carefully assembled over a century by governments, school curricula, and the quiet pressure of national grief that needed somewhere to go. That version is not accurate. Not because the details are wrong in every particular, but because it leaves out what made the war what it actually was. It leaves out the texture, the smell, the administrative precision with which millions of human beings were fed into a system that processed them like raw material and issued form letters when they came out the other side as bodies. What follows is not a glorification of anything. It is not a tribute. It is not an argument. It is a description of what became normal between 1914 and 1918, what soldiers, officers, doctors, bureaucrats, and governments learned to treat as routine, as acceptable, as simply the cost of doing what they were doing. The behaviors described here did not emerge from madness. That would be easier to accept. They emerged from something far more unsettling. They emerged from rationality, from efficiency, from the slow accumulation of institutional decisions made by people sitting in dry rooms far from the front, people who had learned to convert human suffering into column entries and casualty projections and supply requisitions. This is the war as it was organized, not as it was remembered. The first thing that became normal was the acceptance that men would spend months living in holes in the ground, and that this was a sound military strategy. When the war began in August of 1914, the generals on all sides expected it to move. Cavalry was still considered relevant. The Schlieffen Plan assumed German forces could sweep through Belgium and France within 6 weeks and return east to face Russia. British commanders thought in terms of maneuver. French doctrine emphasized offensive spirit, the idea that will and aggression could overcome firepower. None of this survived contact with the machine gun and the artillery shell. By the autumn of 1914, the war on the Western Front had stopped moving in any meaningful sense. Both sides began digging, and then they kept digging, and then they reinforced what they had dug, and then they strung wire in front of what they had reinforced, and then they built second lines and third lines and communication trenches connecting them all, and then they settled in. What had been a tactical emergency became a permanent condition. By the winter of 1914, roughly 475 miles of trenches ran from the English Channel to the Swiss border. Within a year, the British sector alone contained enough trenches that if you laid them end to end, they would stretch from London to Calcutta. The soldiers who lived in these trenches were not there for days or weeks. They were there for years. Rotated in and out on schedules, yes, but always returning, always going back. The trench was not a temporary measure. It became home. It became the central organizing fact of millions of lives. Men learned to sleep in it, eat in it, defecate in it, mourn in it, joke in it, and die in it. And this was considered not a crisis but a logistics problem. The question was never how to end this condition for the men who endured it. The question was how to keep it functional enough to continue. The trenches themselves varied enormously depending on location, season, and how much labor and material a given unit had available. Some portions of the line were relatively stable dry in summer and equipped with wooden duckboards, corrugated iron shelters, and rough furniture built from ammunition crates. Other portions were catastrophic. The Ypres salient in Belgium sat in a low-lying area with a water table barely below the surface. Men dug down 2 feet and hit standing water. They built parapets of sandbags above ground instead. But the sandbags rotted, the bags burst, the mud crept back in. In winter, the walls of the trench were not walls in any architectural sense. They were cold, semi-solid masses of earth that oozed and shifted and collapsed. Men stood in water that rose to their knees. They stood there for hours because there was nowhere to sit. They slept, standing up, leaning against the parapet, their feet submerged, their bodies too exhausted to register the cold. And the army issued guidelines about how to manage this. There were protocols. There were recommended rotations. There were medical recommendations about foot inspections. The existence of the protocols is itself a statement of what had become acceptable. The protocols did not say this should not happen. They said, here is how to manage it when it does. The second behavior that became normal was the expectation that men would walk toward machine gun fire in organized formations. This requires some explanation, not because the generals were fools, but because the decision to do this repeatedly, after seeing what it produced, reflected a specific institutional logic that is worth understanding. The machine gun had been in existence since before the war. The Maxim gun had been used in colonial conflicts across Africa and Asia in the preceding decades, where it had proven devastatingly effective against opponents who lacked equivalent firepower. European military planners knew about machine guns. What they had not fully internalized was what machine guns would do when both sides had them, when the terrain was flat and well observed, when the attackers had no cover, and when the defenders had had weeks or months to prepare their positions and their fields of fire. The attack on the first day of the Battle of the Somme, July 1st, 1916, produced approximately 57,470 British casualties, including nearly 20,000 men killed in a single day. This figure is so large that it resists comprehension. It works out to roughly 1 casualty every 2 seconds across the full daylight hours of that summer day. The men who died did not die because of some sudden catastrophe, some unforeseen accident of war. They died in largely the way that had been predicted. Wire that was supposed to have been cut by artillery had not been cut. Defenders who were supposed to have been killed by the week-long preliminary bombardment had sheltered in deep bunkers and emerged to man their guns when the barrage lifted. The attacking infantry, who had in many cases been told the walk across no man's land would be unopposed, walked in measured lines and were killed in those lines. The response to this was not to immediately abandon the tactic. The response was to analyze what had gone wrong and to plan the next attack. This is the part that matters. Not one bad decision, not one catastrophic morning, but the ongoing institutional conclusion that the approach was sound and the execution had been flawed. Haig's diary entry for July 2nd, the day after the Somme catastrophe, contained no expression of horror. It contained an operational assessment. The War Office continued to plan. The supply chains continued to run. The casualty figures were processed through administrative channels. Replacement drafts were organized. The attacks continued. This was not callousness in the way that word is commonly understood. It was something more structured than that. The men making the decisions had made a calculation, conscious or not, that the losses were acceptable given the strategic objectives. And what is most disturbing about that calculation is not that it was wrong in purely human terms, because it obviously was, but that within the logic of the war as it was being fought, it was not entirely indefensible. The Germans were losing men too. Attrition was a real strategy. The question of whether it was a moral strategy was not on the table. By 1917, the tactic had evolved. Bite and hold operations, rolling barrages, improved communication between infantry and artillery, creeping advances rather than massive waves. The military was learning. It was learning how to do the same thing more efficiently. More men could now be moved forward into a defensive position. Fewer men would die in the approach. The fundamental act of sending men across ground covered by machine guns had not changed. The administration of that act had improved. The third thing that became normal was the treatment of the dead. There were so many of them that the normal rituals of death became impossible to maintain, and so the normal rituals were modified until they bore no resemblance to anything that had previously existed. In civilian life, in the world before 1914, death was managed with considerable ceremony. Bodies were claimed by families. They were washed, dressed, placed in coffins, transported to places of burial, attended by mourners, marked with permanent stones. The entire apparatus of grief had evolved over centuries to give death meaning, to give the living a way to process loss, to mark the transition from alive to gone with something that felt proportionate to the weight of a human life. In the trenches, none of this was possible. Men died faster than they could be buried. Men died in places that could not be reached for weeks or months because the ground between the trench and the body was still under fire. Men died in shell craters and were covered by subsequent shelling and were never found. Men were buried in one location and the ground was shelled again, and the burial was undone and the body was redistributed across a wider area. Men dissolved. Men sank into the mud at Passchendaele and were never recovered, and the mud simply incorporated them, and the next men walked over where they had gone down. The official response to this was the development of systems for recording, identifying, and notating the dead. Dog tags were issued so that identity could theoretically survive death. Graves registration units followed the advancing armies and attempted to locate, identify, and mark casualties. Casualty lists were compiled and published, first in newspapers, then in official gazettes. The British system was extraordinarily thorough by the standards of any previous war. The Commonwealth War Graves Commission, established during the war itself, eventually recorded over 1 million individual deaths. Each man who could be identified received an individual headstone. Each man who could not be identified received inclusion in a collective memorial, his name carved in stone even if his body was lost. This system was meticulous, and it was also a profound accommodation to something that should not have existed. The scale of unrecovered remains was not a failure of the graves registration system. It was the natural result of the scale of the killing. By the end of the war, roughly 300,000 British and Commonwealth soldiers had no known grave. The French had more. The Germans had more still. The Thiepval Memorial on the Somme bears the names of over 72,000 British soldiers who died in that sector and have no identified burial place. The Menin Gate in Ypres bears 54,196 names. The Tyne Cot Memorial has room for nearly 35,000 more. These are not memorials to the fallen in any comforting sense. They are administrative solutions to the problem of unmanageable mortality. The men listed on those walls were not buried because they could not be. The stone lists replaced the graves. The fourth behavior that became normalized was the systematic suppression of information about conditions at the front. This was not a secret conspiracy. It was official policy, implemented with full institutional support, enforced through censorship offices, press liaison units, and the understood expectations of journalists and editors who had reason to cooperate. The Defence of the Realm Act, passed in Britain within days of the declaration of war in August 1914, gave the government extensive powers to suppress information deemed harmful to the war effort. Similar legislation existed in France, Germany, Austria, Hungary, and every other major belligerent. The power was used broadly. Journalists who attempted to reach the front in the early months of the war were turned away, arrested, or expelled. Soldiers' letters were read by censors before being posted. Any description of casualties, locations, unit identifications, conditions, morale, equipment failures, or medical realities was subject to deletion. The censor's scissors left strange holes in correspondence, and soldiers learned to write around them, to use metaphor and understatement, to say they were well when they were not, to say it was quiet when it was not, because they understood that anything else would simply be removed. The official photographers and filmmakers who were eventually allowed at the front operated under strict guidelines about what could be shown. Images of dead British soldiers were prohibited. Images of dead German soldiers were permitted. Images of severe wounds were not used for public distribution. The film produced by Geoffrey Malins and John McDowell of the Battle of the Somme, released in August 1916, showed artillery firing, men going over the top, some images of the wounded being carried to the rear. It was seen by over 20 million people in Britain in its first 6 weeks of release. It was presented as a documentary record of what the battle looked like. And in a narrow sense, it was. But the 20 million people who watched it did not see what the Somme looked like in the hours after the first wave went over. They did not see the bodies in the wire. They did not see the men dying of abdominal wounds who would take days to die. They did not see the communication trenches packed with casualties who could not be moved because stretcher bearers were overwhelmed. They saw a managed version, and this managed version was not produced by malice. It was produced by the reasonable institutional conclusion that showing the actual thing would damage recruitment, morale, and public support for the war. The result of sustained suppression over 4 years was a civilian population whose understanding of what was happening across the Channel was fundamentally incomplete. Families received letters that said fine, managing well, not to worry. They received official telegrams that said regret to inform. They received no explanation of the distance between those two communications, no account of the hours or days or weeks between the last cheerful letter and the final form letter, no description of what had happened in that interval. The information was withheld not because anyone thought it was unnecessary, but because it was understood to be dangerous. Grief at scale was a threat to the war effort, so grief at scale was not described. The fifth normalized behavior was the medical system's handling of psychological collapse. Shell shock, as it came to be called in 1915, was not a term of art invented by sympathetic doctors. It was a term that emerged from the front, because men were presenting with symptoms that had no visible physical cause and that looked, from the outside, like cowardice or malfunction. Men who had been under heavy bombardment were found trembling uncontrollably, unable to speak, unable to walk, unable to respond to commands. Some were mute. Some had lost their sight without any eye injury. Some had lost the ability to move their limbs without any spinal damage. Some were convulsing in ways that resembled epilepsy, but were not epileptic. Some were simply sitting, staring at nothing, not responding to their names, gone somewhere inside themselves from which they could not be immediately retrieved. The initial institutional response to this was disciplinary. Men presenting with these symptoms in the early part of the war were often classified as lacking moral fiber, as shirking, as cowardly. Courts-martial were held. Men were returned to the line. In some cases, men in obvious psychiatric crisis were shot for cowardice or desertion because the army did not have a category for what was actually happening to them. Britain executed 306 soldiers during the war for offenses including cowardice, desertion, and refusing to obey orders. The question of how many of those 306 men were experiencing what would now be recognized as combat stress reactions or post-traumatic stress disorder was never systematically examined at the time. A 2006 Act of the British Parliament posthumously pardoned all of them. This pardon came 90 years after the executions. As the war continued and the numbers of affected men grew beyond the capacity of the disciplinary system to contain, the medical establishment was forced to engage with the problem on its own terms. Dr. Charles Myers, a military physician, formally described shell shock in The Lancet in 1915 and began to develop treatment protocols. These ranged from rest and removal from the front, which was effective but limited by the Army's reluctance to deplete its manpower, to more aggressive treatments including hypnosis, talking therapy in its earliest forms, and, in some facilities, the application of electric current to paralyzed or non-responsive limbs, a treatment that was painful and is now understood as a form of coercive intervention designed as much to get men back to the front as to treat their actual condition. Louis Yealand, a Canadian physician working at the National Hospital in London, documented his treatments in a 1918 book. His approach involved direct confrontation, refusal to allow patients to leave until they produced the required behavior, and electrical stimulation of paralyzed limbs and mute vocal cords. A patient who had been mute for 9 months was treated in a single session that lasted hours and included application of current to the back of the throat. Yealand described the session with clinical satisfaction. The patient spoke. He was recorded as cured. Whether he was cured in any sense that mattered to his ongoing mental health was not the question being asked. Whether he could return to duty was the question being asked. By the end of the war, approximately 80,000 cases of shell shock had been recorded in the British Army alone. The actual number was almost certainly higher because many cases were either unrecorded or reclassified to avoid the implications of the diagnosis. Germany had its own nomenclature and its own debates. France attempted for a period to deny that the condition existed among French troops on the grounds that it implied insufficient national fortitude. The debate about what shell shock was, whether it was physical or psychological, whether it was genuine or performed, whether it was a failure of individual character or a predictable response to unbearable conditions, was never resolved during the war. It was deferred. Men were treated and returned to the line, or were invalided home and left to manage as best they could, with no systematic follow-up, no long-term care structure, no pension category that adequately described what had happened to them. Many simply deteriorated at home, unable to work, unable to sleep, unable to explain to their families why they could no longer function in the world as it existed before they left. The sixth behavior that hardened into routine was the use of poison gas as a standard battlefield tool. The first large-scale use of chlorine gas by German forces at Ypres on April 22, 1915, produced a response in Allied observers that was initially disbelieving. The greenish-yellow cloud that drifted across the line toward French Algerian and French territorial troops was not immediately recognized for what it was. Some men thought it was a smokescreen. By the time it reached the trenches, men were choking, drowning in their own fluid-filled lungs, their eyes and throats burning with a sensation they had no category for. The Allied line broke. The Germans advanced. The attack was not fully exploited, possibly because the German command had not expected it to work as well as it did, or possibly because they lacked the reserves to consolidate the breakthrough. The immediate military advantage of the initial attack did not persist. The chemical weapon itself did. Within weeks, the British were developing their own gas capabilities. By the end of 1915, both sides were producing and deploying chlorine in increasing quantities. Then came phosgene, which was more lethal and harder to detect because it smelled faintly of cut hay rather than the sharp odor of chlorine. Then came mustard gas in 1917, which was not primarily designed to kill but to incapacitate, to burn skin and mucous membranes, to blind temporarily, to create casualties who would require care, and therefore pull medical resources from the front. Mustard gas settled low on the ground and persisted for days in soil and vegetation. It could be absorbed through skin without a soldier knowing he had been exposed. The burns appeared hours later. The official position of all major belligerents was that gas warfare was a legitimate extension of existing methods. There were strategic arguments for this. Gas could be used to suppress defensive positions before an infantry assault. Gas shells mixed into artillery barrages were difficult to distinguish from high explosive until symptoms appeared. The organizational structures that supported gas warfare, the factories producing the agents, the units trained in deployment, the artillery crews who incorporated gas shells into their firing routines, were all treated as normal parts of the military apparatus. Gas masks became as standard as rifles. The training of soldiers to put on a mask in under 10 seconds in darkness while under fire became a routine component of basic military instruction. Men died from gas. More men were incapacitated. Many men who survived gas exposure in the war died years or decades later from the long-term effects on their lungs, their eyes, their skin. The total number of gas casualties across the war is estimated at over 1 million, with roughly 90,000 deaths directly attributable to gas. The ratio of death to total casualty was lower for gas than for artillery or rifle fire, and this fact was sometimes cited as evidence that gas was a more humane weapon, which is a sentence that reveals something about how the parameters of discussion had shifted during the war. The comparison being made was not between gas and peace, but between gas and other methods of killing. Within that comparison, gas produced fewer dead per 1,000 exposed. This was offered as a kind of mitigation. The seventh behavior that became ordinary was the bureaucratic classification of human beings by their military utility. Every army engaged in this process, but the British system is particularly well documented. Men were medically classified on entry into service according to their physical condition, and then reclassified throughout the war as their condition changed. Category A men were fit for general service at the front. Category B men could perform garrison duties or home service. Category C men were capable of light work. Category D men were temporarily unfit. Category E men were permanently unfit and should be discharged. The categories sound clinical and rational. Their function was to extract maximum utility from every available body. Men who had been wounded and returned to the system were reclassified and assigned to whatever duty their post-wound capacity allowed. A man who had lost a hand might be reclassified to clerical work. A man who had lost a foot might be assigned to a base depot. A man whose lungs had been damaged by gas might be categorized as fit for light duties and assigned to guard service. The body was assessed, its remaining capabilities inventoried, and its next assignment determined accordingly. The man inside the body was not the operative variable. The man was the sum of his physical capacities. When those capacities fell below a useful threshold, the man was discharged and replaced. This system operated with remarkable consistency and thoroughness. Medical boards convened regularly at base hospitals, at convalescent depots, at home service installations. They reviewed cases, updated categories, decided fates. Men appeared before these boards in their thousands every week for 4 years. The boards did not ask how the men felt about returning to the front. The boards determined whether the men were physically capable of returning to the front. These are different questions. The distinction was not an oversight. It was the premise of the system. The 8th normalized behavior was the management of food as a variable separate from human need. The caloric and nutritional requirements of men engaged in sustained physical activity in cold, wet conditions are substantial. The armies knew this. Nutritionists and medical officers provided guidance on required caloric intake. Supply chains were constructed to meet these requirements, and they frequently did not. The gap between what men needed to sustain health and what they actually received was chronic in most armies and catastrophic in some. The British Army maintained relatively stable supply chains through much of the war, particularly after 1916, and British soldiers received more reliable rations than their German or Austro-Hungarian counterparts. Even so, the quality and composition of what arrived at the front was often poor. Bully beef, which was canned corned beef, and hardtack biscuits constituted the bulk of many men's diet for extended periods. Bread, when available, was often stale. Tea was served in volumes that would have been remarkable in peacetime. The monotony of the diet was itself a source of sustained demoralization, and this was understood by the medical establishment, which recommended variety, and by the supply administration, which found variety difficult to deliver to forward positions under fire, and the practical outcome was that men ate what arrived in the tins. The German situation deteriorated significantly as the British naval blockade tightened through 1916 and 1917. The blockade prevented the import of fertilizers and animal feed as well as food directly, which reduced domestic agricultural production. The German civilian population was subject to rationing that fell significantly below nutritional requirements by 1917. Bread was adulterated with sawdust and potato flour. Meat was scarce. Fat was almost unavailable. The calories available per civilian per day fell to levels associated with significant malnutrition. The German army maintained its soldiers' rations at higher levels than the civilian population for obvious operational reasons. But the soldiers knew what was happening at home. Letters described it. Some men deserted to go back to families they knew were hungry. The blockade killed, by British government estimates, somewhere between 250,000 and 750,000 German civilians through malnutrition and related illness by the end of the war. This is a broad range that reflects genuine uncertainty about attribution, but the scale is not in dispute. The blockade was a legitimate act of war under the laws as they then stood. Its results were documented and were understood to be a feature rather than a bug. Civilian hunger was a strategic objective. The 9th behavior that hardened into normalcy was the deployment of men who were visibly medically unfit for combat. The pressure to maintain troop numbers was constant and intense throughout the war. Replacement drafts were organized with urgency. Men were returned to duty from medical treatment faster than recovery would have recommended. Men whose physical condition at the time of their initial enlistment might have resulted in rejection were passed by medical boards that were under pressure to maintain supply. As the war continued and the pool of ideally fit men was progressively depleted, the standards adjusted. By 1917 and 1918, men were being classified as fit for service, who in 1914 would have been turned away at the recruiting office. Men with flat feet, with defective vision, with histories of respiratory illness, with teeth so poor that they could not adequately chew the available rations. The army needed bodies. The medical requirements for those bodies moved to accommodate the supply. This adjustment was not hidden. It was documented in medical records and administrative correspondence. The categories were revised. The inspection criteria were modified. The change was discussed in bureaucratic language as a rational response to changing circumstances. What it amounted to was the systematic lowering of the threshold for deciding that a man was expendable. The 10th behavior that became routine was the processing of battlefield trauma as a logistical category. When a man was wounded at the front, the system that engaged with him was oriented around determining his likely return to duty timeline and his ongoing cost to the military medical establishment. Triage at the regimental aid post made immediate decisions about who could be treated quickly and returned, who needed evacuation further back, and who was too severely injured to benefit from treatment resources that were needed elsewhere. The third category, men who were expectant in the terminology of triage, men expected to die regardless of treatment, were made comfortable and left to die. This is not unusual in emergency medicine. What is notable is the scale. During major offensives, the numbers of expectant cases at forward medical stations could be substantial, and the staff who made these determinations and then moved to the next patient were doing so within a system that had normalized the decision not to treat as a routine operational judgment. Men who survived the initial triage and were evacuated to casualty clearing stations and then to base hospitals entered a system that was genuinely impressive in its organization and often in its outcomes. Surgical techniques advanced significantly during the war because of the volume of cases. Blood transfusion was developed and refined. Reconstructive facial surgery had its origins in the work of Harold Gillies at Aldershot, who performed operations on men with injuries that had no precedent in medical history, because the weapons producing them had no precedent in medical history. The casualty clearing station system evolved from improvised emergency medicine in 1914 into a sophisticated tripartite process by 1916. Men who in previous wars would have died of infection survived because of antiseptic technique and wound management protocols. The same system that saved men also processed them. A man who recovered sufficiently was returned to duty if his classification permitted it. A man who could not return to duty was invalided home. The home received him and then largely let him go. The pension system, introduced under the provisions of the Naval and Military War Pensions Act, provided some financial support to disabled veterans and to the widows and dependents of men killed. The amounts were modest. The process of applying was bureaucratic and adversarial. Men who claimed disability were required to demonstrate the connection between their disability and their military service. Men with conditions that had no visible physical correlate. Men with psychological damage that did not express itself in missing limbs or measurable deficits found the system particularly difficult to navigate. The war had injured them in ways the system had no category for, and the system declined to acknowledge what it had no category for. The 11th thing that became normal was the use of age as a rough sorting mechanism with little relationship to actual human developmental reality. The minimum enlistment age in Britain at the start of the war was 18, with a provision that men under 19 could not be sent overseas. This rule was widely circumvented. Boys of 14, 15 and 16 presented themselves at recruiting offices across the country and were accepted by recruiters who either did not examine the claim of age carefully or who understood that their job was to recruit and that asking too many questions was counterproductive. The standard procedure was to ask a prospective recruit his age, note the answer, and accept it at face value unless the discrepancy was so obvious that it could not be overlooked. The army was aware that underage soldiers were enlisting. Instructions were periodically issued reminding recruiting officers of the minimum age requirements. Discharge applications submitted by parents of boys who had enlisted under age were processed, and some discharges were granted, though the process was slow and not always successful. Boys who had reached France and were serving in units were often left in place because disrupting the unit for the sake of compliance with an age rule was considered less important than maintaining unit cohesion. Boys fought and died at Ypres, at the Somme, at Passchendaele, not as a scandal, but as a statistical feature of the recruitment system. The youngest British soldier confirmed to have been killed in the war was Private John Condon, an Irish soldier who died at Ypres in 1915. He was 14 years old. He is buried in Poel Capelle Cemetery with a headstone that originally recorded his age as 14 before subsequent research raised questions. His exact age at death remains debated, but the plausibility of the figure is not in question. The system that processed boys as soldiers was not a rogue operation. It was the normal operation, slightly imprecisely applied. The 12th behavior that normalized during the war was the administrative processing of mass death through form letters and standard notifications. When a British soldier was killed, the War Office was responsible for notifying his next of kin. The notification took the form of a telegram delivered by a post office messenger, typically in civilian clothes to avoid the uniform becoming too strongly associated with bad news in the public mind. The telegram contained a standardized message: "Deeply regret to inform you that," followed by the name, rank, and regimental number of the deceased, followed by "killed in action," followed by the date. No description of circumstances. No information about where the body was or whether it had been recovered. No account of how the man had died. Just the administrative record of the fact. This standardized notification was received by families across Britain and the Commonwealth at a rate that during major offensives ran into thousands per day. The families who received these telegrams did not receive a personal communication. They received a form. The form had been designed to be easily produced at scale. This was practical. Personalized letters from commanding officers sometimes followed, and these varied enormously in their quality and sincerity, ranging from evidently genuine expressions of condolence to obviously templated paragraphs that could be inserted into any letter with the substitution of a name. The army was managing grief as a processing problem, and it developed the tools appropriate to processing problems: efficiency, standardization, scale. The 13th behavior that became ordinary was the reclassification of desertion and breakdown as disciplinary rather than medical issues. Men left the line. They left for many reasons. Some left because they had concluded rationally that they could not survive further service and that leaving was the only alternative to death. Some left in a state of dissociation so complete that they were not making a decision in any meaningful sense. Some left during an attack, separated from their unit in the chaos, lost in unfamiliar terrain, unable to find their way back, wandering in a landscape that had been transformed by shelling into a geography with no reference points. Some were found by military police within hours and returned to their units. Some were found days later, clearly in a state of severe mental disturbance and processed through a system that had no adequate category for them. The military law of all major belligerents made desertion in the face of the enemy a capital offense. This was not a war emergency measure. It was the existing law applied to a new context. The application of the law required courts-martial, which required officers, witnesses, transcripts, findings, and in capital cases, confirmation at the senior command level. The process was not summary. It had forms to fill out and procedures to follow. And in the following of those procedures, men whose mental state was plainly extraordinary were found guilty of ordinary military offenses and sentenced to death. The British Army shot 26 men for cowardice during the war, and a larger number for other offenses including desertion and mutiny. The French Army executed perhaps 600 men, though precise figures are disputed. Germany's figures are also uncertain. These numbers are small in proportion to the total casualties of the war, but they exist as markers of an institutional commitment to maintaining the formal structure of military discipline, even when the circumstances of the men being disciplined were manifestly outside anything the disciplinary structure had been designed to address. The men shot for cowardice were shot in full accordance with the regulations. The regulations had been designed for a different kind of war. The regularity with which they were applied did not change what was being applied them to. The 14th thing that became normal was the expectation that men returning from the front could, with sufficient fortitude, resume normal civilian life without formal transition support. The British government established no systematic program for the psychological reintegration of returning veterans. Men who had served for 2, 3, 4 years in conditions that no human psychological architecture had evolved to endure came back to their homes and were expected to become the men they had been before they left. Those who could not do this, who drank heavily, who could not hold employment, who woke screaming, who struck their wives, who could not tolerate crowds or noise or enclosed spaces, who sat staring at nothing for hours, were understood to be struggling, but the understanding did not produce a support structure adequate to the scale of the problem. The charitable and voluntary organizations that attempted to fill this gap were numerous and well-intentioned and entirely insufficient. The Star and Garter Home, the King's Fund, the numerous local organizations that raised money and provided meals and accommodation to disabled veterans. These organizations operated without government coordination, with limited resources, with no clinical infrastructure, and with no evidence base for what actually helped men recover from what had been done to them. Men who had been exposed to gas, men who had witnessed things that no psychological system could have prepared them for, men who had functioned within a social order premised entirely on organized killing for years, were discharged and returned to a civilian world that did not know how to ask the right questions and would not have known what to do with the answers. The 15th normalized behavior was the use of propaganda as a systematic element of state communication, not as a wartime emergency measure, but as a permanent feature of public information management. The British War Propaganda Bureau, established within weeks of the declaration of war and operating from Wellington House under Charles Masterman, produced hundreds of pamphlets, books, films, posters, and articles within its first year of operation. The material was produced by writers, academics, artists, and journalists who were recruited by the Bureau and who understood that they were producing advocacy rather than neutral reporting. Many of them did not disclose their Bureau connections when publishing. Work that appeared to be the independent judgments of distinguished scholars and public figures was in fact commissioned output from a government propaganda operation. The Bureau's work extended internationally, with particular attention to the United States, which was neutral until 1917 and whose public and political opinion was considered critical to eventual Allied success. The German atrocity stories produced during and after the invasion of Belgium in 1914, some of which were accurate and some of which were significantly exaggerated, were systematically disseminated through Bureau channels and through sympathetic journalists and publishers in America. The Bryce Report, an official British government investigation into German conduct in Belgium, was widely distributed and accepted as authoritative. Some of its specific claims were later shown to be unverifiable or false. The report served its purpose. American public opinion moved. This was not unique to Britain. All major belligerents ran sophisticated propaganda operations. Germany produced its own versions. France ran its own programs. The United States, after entering the war, established the Committee on Public Information under George Creel, which operated with a scale and intensity that affected every form of public communication in the country. But the mechanism is less interesting than what it produced, which was a generation of populations who had lived through 4 years of managed public communication and who had no reliable way to assess how much of what they understood about the war reflected what had actually happened. The suppression of accurate information and the substitution of managed narrative had been sufficiently systematic and sustained that the populations of all belligerent nations emerged from the war with understandings of it that were in important ways constructed rather than observed. The 16th behavior that hardened into ordinary practice was the organizational treatment of colonial and non-European troops as human material, with lower administrative priority. The British Empire mobilized approximately 1.5 million Indian soldiers, hundreds of thousands of men from Australia, Canada, New Zealand and South Africa, and additional forces from African territories, the Caribbean, and elsewhere. The French drew on over 600,000 soldiers from North Africa, West Africa, Madagascar, and Indochina. These men fought in the same battles and died in the same numbers as their European counterparts. They did not receive the same administrative treatment. Indian soldiers at the front were paid at rates below those of British soldiers doing identical work. Men from African territories received even less. The pension and disability provisions that existed, however inadequate for British soldiers, often did not apply in equal measure to colonial troops. The casualty notification system that sent telegrams to families in Britain did not have an equivalent apparatus for families in the Punjab or Senegal or Tobago. Men simply did not come back, and their families in many cases received no official notification at any point. The labor battalions, which performed the enormous and dangerous work of moving supplies, building fortifications, recovering casualties, and maintaining the infrastructure of the front, were disproportionately staffed with non-European men who had been recruited from the Chinese Labor Corps, from South Africa, from Egypt, from the West Indies. These men were not classified as combatants in many cases, and therefore did not receive the formal acknowledgements and protections extended to soldiers. They worked in proximity to the front, in conditions that were often as dangerous as those of the men they were supporting, and they died in numbers that are still not fully accounted for in the official histories. The Chinese Labor Corps, which contributed approximately 140,000 men who served under contract, experienced mortality that was recorded sporadically and only partially. The graves of Chinese Labor Corps men are scattered across the former front in France and Belgium, maintained today by the Commonwealth War Graves Commission with the same individual headstones as British soldiers, but the decades during which their deaths received less documentation and their graves less attention reflect the priorities of the system that employed them. The 17th thing that became routine was the industrial scaling of the armaments production process and the normalization of its relationship to the killing it supported. By 1916, British munitions factories were employing over 3 million workers, the majority of them women who had entered industrial employment as men, left for the front. Shell production, which had been insufficient to support the rate of artillery fire the war required in its first year, producing the so-called Shell Scandal of 1915, was reorganized under the Ministry of Munitions established by Lloyd George. Output increased to levels that would have been unimaginable in 1914. By 1916, British factories were producing 187 million shells per year. The women who produced these shells worked in conditions that were frequently dangerous. Trinitrotoluene, or TNT, which was used in filling shells, turned the skin of workers who handled it yellow from chemical absorption. These workers were known as canary girls. The nickname made the condition sound almost cheerful. The reality was that TNT exposure caused toxic hepatitis, aplastic anemia, and in some cases death. The factories were noisy, often poorly ventilated and operated around the clock. Women worked 12-hour shifts. The work paid better than domestic service or textile labor, which was the comparison being made. The absolute standard was not the operative measure. The relative improvement was, and so women came to the factories and made the shells that killed the men who had gone to the front. And the system required this, and the system received it, and the system processed the output with the administrative regularity of any large-scale industrial operation. The 18th behavior that normalized was the continuation of the war after the point at which its original stated objectives had effectively ceased to be recoverable. The war began with specific geopolitical precipitants: the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, the mobilization cascades, the German ultimatum to Belgium, the British guarantee. By 1916, the specific circumstances that had triggered these events had been superseded by the war itself. The war had become the point. Governments were fighting to justify the losses already incurred. It would be politically and psychologically impossible to accept an inconclusive peace, to admit that the hundreds of thousands already dead had died for an outcome that had not been achieved. The sunk cost of the dead made continuing the war seem more rational than stopping it, even as the continuing of the war produced more dead, who would then make stopping seem even less rational. This feedback loop was not hidden. It was discussed in different terms in cabinet meetings and parliamentary debates and newspaper editorials. The argument for a negotiated peace was made repeatedly by figures including Lord Lansdowne in Britain, who circulated a memorandum in 1916 arguing that a negotiated settlement was preferable to continued mass casualties and was largely ignored, and whose public letter arguing the same case in 1917 was condemned as defeatist. The argument that continuing the war made strategic sense was, in the narrow sense of maintaining the political legitimacy of the governments prosecuting it, more persuasive to those governments than the argument for stopping. The men dying in the process of this calculation were not the operative variable. The 19th behavior that became embedded in normal practice was the official indifference to what happened to men after the war ended. The armistice of November 11, 1918, ended the fighting with an abruptness that the military and social infrastructure of the belligerent nations was not prepared to manage. The mechanisms of mass mobilization did not have equivalent mechanisms for mass demobilization. Men were discharged in irregular batches according to logistical priorities that did not always match the expectations of soldiers who had served the longest and wanted to come home first. The British Army prioritized the release of men with particular civilian skills on the grounds that economic reconstruction required certain kinds of workers before releasing men who had served longer but whose skills were less immediately needed. This caused significant unrest. There were mutinies at British camps in France in early 1919. Men who were discharged received a gratuity, a sum of money calculated according to their rank and length of service, a set of civilian clothes known colloquially as a D-mob suit, and a document certifying their military service. They received no vocational training, no housing assistance, no medical follow-up, and no formal psychological support. They were returned to their families and their communities with the expectation that the community would absorb them. The community tried. In many cases, the absorption was incomplete. Not because the community was unwilling, but because what had happened to the men was not comprehensible to people who had not been there, and the men themselves often found the incomprehension more difficult to manage than they had expected. The unemployment rate among veterans in the years immediately following the armistice was substantial. The Homes Fit for Heroes slogan that Lloyd George's government used in the 1918 election campaign, implying a comprehensive post-war reconstruction that would reward returning soldiers with housing and employment and a functioning social order worth having fought for, did not survive contact with post-war economic reality. The Depression of 1921, the gradual erosion of the industrial base that had sustained wartime employment, the housing stock that had not been built and could not be quickly built, the pension rates that did not keep pace with inflation, the medical infrastructure that did not exist for the purposes required of it. The promise of the slogan and the reality of the decade that followed it are a measurement of the distance between the war's rhetoric and its results. The 20th behavior that normalized, and may be the most important to understand because it underpins all the others, was the bureaucratic institutionalization of the idea that the death of individuals at scale was an acceptable price for the achievement of political objectives, and that the people making this calculation were not required to reckon personally with the human content of it. The decision to send a division over the top was made by a general who was not going over the top. The decision to maintain the blockade was made by naval officers and cabinet ministers who were not going hungry. The decision to return a shell-shocked man to duty was made by a medical board member who had not been shelled. The decision to classify a man's death as acceptable losses was made by planners who were planning, not dying. This separation of decision from consequence did not originate with World War I. It exists in every large organizational structure and every military in history. What World War I did was industrialize it. The scale of the decisions being made, the distances across which they operated, the organizational layers between the decision maker and the outcome were all unprecedented. A general in a chateau 30 miles from the front was not merely geographically distant from the men his orders affected, he was institutionally distant. The organizational structure ensured that the consequences of his decisions arrived at his desk as numbers in a report, not as the specific sensory reality of what those numbers represented. This is not unique to World War I. It is a feature of industrial scale. World War I was where that feature operated at its most visible extremity. The war ended on November 11, 1918, at 11 in the morning. The armistice had been signed at 5 in the morning, giving 6 hours before the ceasefire was to take effect. During those 6 hours, fighting continued. Artillery fired. Men were killed. On the American front, General William Wright ordered attacks after the armistice was signed, but before it took effect, on the grounds that maintaining offensive pressure until the last moment was correct military practice. Approximately 11,000 men were killed, wounded, or went missing on the final day of the war, November 11, 1918, more than had been killed on D-Day in the next war, 26 years later. The last confirmed British soldier killed before the armistice took effect was Private George Edwin Ellison, a veteran who had served from the very beginning of the war, killed at 9:30 in the morning, 90 minutes before the guns stopped. The last German soldier killed is recorded as Lieutenant Thomas, who died at 10:45, 15 minutes before the ceasefire. The last American soldier killed was Private Henry Gunther, who was shot while charging a German machine gun position at 10:59, 60 seconds before the armistice came into force. His commanding officer had tried to wave him back. The machine gun crew, reportedly aware the war was minutes from ending, tried to wave him off. He kept advancing. He was killed at 10:59. The war ended at 11. The engagement that killed him was duly recorded in the unit's action report and processed through the relevant administrative channels.